We often hear bad news on a very frequent basis, on a daily basis. But today, I want to celebrate some good news. We need something to bring a smile to our face. Good news today, concerning the Latin Mass, as it's often called. Stick around to find out more. Well, lately we've been hearing rumors that Pope Francis is going to further restrict, maybe even entirely discontinue, the Missal of 1962, what's often called the Latin Mass. In fact, there's just been a lot of people discussing this lately, and it's caused quite a bit of concern for people who appreciate good liturgies with reverence and tradition and so on. And I want to say, I do think that I understand the concern because Pope Francis has already put some restrictions on the Latin Mass with Traditionis Custodes. And there's a lot of people who feel like, you know what, that wasn't very helpful because I benefit tremendously from this particular liturgy. I think it's beautiful. It enriches my spiritual life. And further restricting this in the way that he did with Traditionis Custodes, there's some people who feel like that wasn't helpful for them because they were benefiting from it and they weren't doing what some others do, and that is weaponizing that particular liturgy. They weren't using it to dissent against the Catholic Church, against the magisterium. Again, some people were doing that, but there's quite a few other people who say, hey, I wasn't doing that. But perhaps my Latin Mass community got restricted because of what some others are doing. And so there's some people who have a concern because they feel like, look, there's a real pastoral need for this. And some of the good people are being punished because of some of the bad things. Well, so I understand the concern. In fact, I did a whole show at length about it called "Is Pope Francis Banning the Latin Mass?" Explaining or examining the rumors. I go over the question of should he restrict the Latin Mass any further, and can he? Does he even have that kind of authority as the Pope? Is that actually within his um, jurisdiction, or is this something ultra vires beyond his authority? So we explore that there. But we've kind of been waiting to hear, okay, well, what's going to come out of Rome? And we saw just a couple days ago that the prior general of the Institute of Christ the King had a private audience with Pope Francis. And a lot of people said, oh no, oh boy, what's happening here? Because on the same day, Pope Francis also met with Cardinal Fernandez, the head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. And so some people were concerned, okay, is there going to be further restrictions on the Missal of 62, perhaps with the Institute of Christ the King? Well, there is some information that has just come out, and it's good news. Let me share my screen, and let's go directly to the source of this information. From the Institute of Christ the King, sovereignpriest.org.uk. Here it is. Private audience of the prior general and the sovereign pope. You can see them right there, shaking hands. They just met. 24th of June, the 45th anniversary of his priestly ordination by St. John Paul II. Monsignor Wach, I guess is how you pronounce his last name, prior general of our institute, was received in private audience by His Holiness Pope Francis, accompanied by Monsignor Schmitz, Vicar General of the Institute, and by Canon Valadier, Provincial of France. You can see them having a pleasant discussion. Pope Francis is smiling, everybody's happy. So you can anticipate some good news here. The audience was an occasion to thank the Holy Father for his inspiring apostolic letter dedicated to St. Francis de Sales, our patron saint. Monsignor was able to present all the pastoral work carried out by the priests of the Institute throughout the world in the service of souls. And by the way, I can tell you, I've been to some of their liturgies and they are awesome. Absolutely awesome. Up north over in Michigan, telling you, they're doing it right. By the way, I think yeah, it was in Michigan. On two occasions, the Pope insisted that we continue to serve the Church according to our own proper charism and the spirit of unity and communion, which the harmony and balance of the Salesian spirituality allowed. That's the money quote right there. That's the big news. Well, why is that? Well, specifically because their charism explicitly includes the preservation of the liturgy of the Missal of 1962, what's called the Latin Mass. This isn't something that is hidden. Everyone knows this. This is part of their charism. You can see this right here from the same website, recognizing the importance of a deep harmony between faith, liturgy, life, and the power of beauty and attracting the human senses to the things above. An integral part of the Institute's charism is the use of the traditional Latin liturgy of 1962 for the holy sacrifice of the Mass and the other sacraments. So this is a big part of their charism, is to preserve this liturgy. And Pope Francis, on two occasions during this meeting, says, continue that. Now, obviously, they also have some other charisms. He's saying, hey, continue the whole thing. And that includes their celebration of the Missal of 1962. You know, we've heard people out there lately saying, you know, Pope Francis just hates the Latin Mass. No, that's not it. Pope Francis does have a problem with people who are weaponizing this great liturgy. And rightly so. He should have a problem with them. And any faithful Catholic should also have a problem with them. But that, of course, doesn't describe everybody who appreciates this liturgy. I appreciate the liturgy. I'm not a schismatic. I'm not a dissenter. I don't use that liturgy or any liturgy for that matter, as a weapon to beat the magisterium over the head. No. And so there's good and faithful people who appreciate the liturgy. It speaks to them maybe a little bit more than other liturgies. And there's nothing wrong with recognizing that you have those people and they're not doing anything to weaponize it. So perhaps it's not a good idea to restrict their access to that particular liturgy. Now, yeah, we need to address the people who are weaponizing it, of course, but the people who aren't, there's a real pastoral need that needs to be met there. Now, of course, we can discuss also the need to understand the liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council. Now, obviously, we can have a debate on whether or not we've actually realized some of those reforms, but there is a catechetical need for us to understand why the Council Fathers adopted the position that they adopted. But be that as it may, there's still nothing wrong with anybody who wants to preserve this liturgical expression, as long as it's in communion with the successor of St. Peter and it's not being weaponized. I fully support any liturgy, whether it has been preserved or not, because there are some liturgical rites that have not been preserved. But, you know, I support everybody if they want to tap into some of the riches liturgically that we have in our history, as long as it's not being used to bash the magisterium over the head or deny some things from the magisterium, as some are doing. So Pope Francis isn't against the liturgy per se, but he is against some who are abusing it. Now, that's not the case in this particular situation here. So Pope Francis says, hey, continue that charism. And, you know, I suspected that was going to be the case here. Again, I discuss it in this video right here. Latin Mass banned, question mark. Is Pope Francis banning the Latin Mass, examining the rumors? What I said is, I could see Pope Francis further restricting access to this liturgy in a diocesan context. Maybe. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what the future holds. But I could see that potentially happening. Now, is that a good idea? That's a different question. Again, I consider that in the video, worth checking out there. I go over the pros and cons for whether or not Pope Francis should further restrict diocesan access to the Missal of 62. But if he is going to do it, I think it would only be in that context. I don't think it would be for, I told you all this last week, I don't think it would be for the Institute of Christ the King or the FSSP and others like this who have a special charism to preserve this particular expression of the Roman Rite. I don't see Pope Francis touching that, is what I said before, and this further confirms that. It doesn't appear that Pope Francis is going to interfere with what they're doing, because this is specifically one of their charisms. This is one of the reasons why they exist as an institute. And Pope Francis recognizes that. He recognizes there are riches, there's beauty there, there's a pastoral need. So hey, keep going and doing what you're doing. And he sends his gratitude and prayers, as this notes here, for this group. And I think that that's a great thing. That's a wonderful victory for us to celebrate. Again, we often hear bad news. It's good to hear some good news, right? And I also have to point out, we saw also recently, he told the fraternity, the FSSP specifically, that they should also continue their charism. I think I covered that a few months ago, because this was back in March, but let me share my screen just so you can see it. This is, again, another one of those reasons why I feel like, hey, look, if something is coming down the pike on further restricting the Missal of 62, it's not going to touch the FSSP or Institute of Christ the King. It's going to be probably just for a diocesan context, for better or worse, So this is from the FSSP.com website on March the 1st, 2024. Following a request from the priestly fraternity of St. Peter, Pope Francis invited the Superior General to meet with him. So he actually invited him to come. He received them in an audience, as well as a few others. The meeting was an opportunity for them to express their deep gratitude to the Holy Father for the decree of February 11th, 2022, where Pope Francis confirmed the liturgical specificity of the Fraternity of St. Peter. So after Traditionis Custodes came out and Pope Francis restricted access in some context to this liturgy, the FSSP was really worried. Okay, hey, does this apply to us? Pope Francis made it clear, no, this actually doesn't apply to you guys. This was in a different context. But it was also an occasion for them to share with him the difficulties encountered in its application. The Pope was very understanding. He invited the Fraternity of St. Peter to continue to build up ecclesial communion ever more fully through its own proper charism. What's one of their biggest charisms? To preserve the liturgy of the Missal of 1962. So again, Pope Francis says, hey, yeah, keep it going. He doesn't have a problem when it's being done properly in the appropriate context and it's not being weaponized. But now if his brother bishops are saying, hey, in certain contexts, in a diocesan context, it is being weaponized, then Pope Francis is going to respond to that. Which is why I say, hey, look, if you preserve this particular expression of the Roman Rite, if you prefer and appreciate this particular expression of the Roman Rite and you want to preserve it, okay, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a great thing. You have an advocate with me. I support you in supporting all of the riches liturgical or otherwise, of the Catholic Church. You have an advocate with me. I'm on board with that. I support you. But my advice to you would be, don't prove Pope Francis right when he says there are people who are weaponizing this. Because again, there are, and he has been proven right. It's not everybody, but it is a key group of people. So my thing is, if you're one of those faithful Catholics who loves this liturgy, don't prove Pope Francis right. Actually, prove him wrong and show him, Holy Father, there might be some people who are weaponizing it, but that's not us. Show him that is not you. And I think what will happen is Pope Francis will be a lot more open to further preserving and maybe even spreading this liturgical patrimony. So that would be my advice. Now, I did see something from Rorati Celli, who is the source of this news that, Pope Francis is going to further restrict this expression of the Roman Rite. And I wanted to see what they had to say about this issue with the ICKSP. They say more details are to be released soon, but their headline says, "No news is good news," in reference to this. And they copy and pasted the very thing I just read to you from the ICK. But I want to say, I guess maybe they're missing it, or maybe I'm missing something. I don't think there's no news here. It's right here. There's news right here. On 2 occasions during this meeting, the Pope insisted that we continue to serve the church according to our own proper charism. And you can't say, well, maybe they're talking about like on 2 previous occasions, because no, they go on to say the Holy Father also expresses gratitude for the prayers. And so this is something that happened during that meeting. So I don't think this is the case that no news is good news. I think, in fact, there is news here, and it is good news. It's that Pope Francis is encouraging for them to continue their charism that includes preservation of this liturgical expression. So, like I said, I wanted to sneak this one in because, hey, we all need to hear some good stuff. We all need to hear these victories, and I suspect there will be more information coming out about this soon, so stay tuned for more. Now, I want to shift gears briefly and interact with with a video that I saw from The Hill about Pope Francis, Vigano, the liturgy, LGBTQ issues in relation to Pope Francis. Is he on board with it or not? They did a video about this about 4 days ago, and I want to interact with some of that at the other end of this break. So stay tuned for more right after this.
For a little girl growing up Catholic today, will she ever participate as a clergy member in the church?
No.
He shut that down. Hey friends, I'm now teaching as an adjunct professor at Catholic Polytechnic University, and I am excited to announce that we will be offering the first ever Magisterial Studies Certificate program. It consists of 3 courses: an introduction to the magisterium, councils, dogmas, canons, and decrees, and evaluating magisterial teachings. If you want to further your education and learn more about Catholic teaching authority, this is the program for you. Check out catholicpolytechnic.org and click on the certificate tab at the top to sign up for the course today. All right, we are going to continue here. I want to take a look again at a video put out by The Hill former Vatican ambassador, calls Pope Francis a servant of Satan. And so they discuss Vigano. They discuss Pope Francis in relation to gay blessings. They talk about the liturgy, all sorts of things. And I don't know a whole lot about this channel. They have 2 million subscribers, though, so they definitely have some influence. And I watched it with intrigue because as they were commenting on these affairs, there's actually a surprising level of accuracy to some of the claims that they make. Some. Now, there are some faulty information, some gaps in their knowledge on some of these subjects. I'm going to fill in the gaps. So I'm not saying everything is accurate here, but I was actually a little bit surprised that they picked up on a few points in these discussions, because some of the points are often overlooked in a broader discussion of these events and topics. And so I was a little surprised. And so let's review that together. I think it will be profitable. I'm going to share my screen, and you should be able to see it right around now. Let's go ahead and begin. Here we go.
The Pope is making headlines today after the Vatican charged a critic of his with the crime of schism and denial of the legitimacy of the Pope. The critic, Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, is the former Vatican ambassador to the U.S. and has long been outspoken against the Pope. Vigano has called the Pope a liberal servant of Satan and called for his resignation and arrest. Vigano, who said the accusations against him were an honor, will now have to face a...
Somewhat ironic, because as I've pointed out, Martin Luther was in part excommunicated, and the very bull that excommunicated him, one of the reasons he was excommunicated is he was saying that one should cherish their excommunications from the Catholic Church. Somewhat ironic, right?
Rare penal canon trial. And in other Pope news, a student has called on Pope Francis to stop using anti-LGBTQ+ language. In a panel discussion between the Pope and students, one student said the Pope's use of offensive language against the LGBTQ+ community has caused immense pain. The student went on to say he's been outcast and bullied due to his bisexuality.
Well, look, I'm not in support of bullying anybody, heterosexual or homosexual, or, I don't support that. But look, I have to come out and say it. I'm sorry. But if somebody says, oh, well, hearing this particular word that discriminates against me is just causes immense pain, I'm sorry, but that sounds like this person's really fragile. Do you know, come on now, most people have to endure way more than just hearing a few names. Now, I'm not saying that it's right. I'm not saying that one should be bullied. But what I'm saying is life is tough. You're going to have to go through a lot of things. And being called a name, if that causes you tremendous suffering, you're a very fragile person, and you're very sheltered, and you're not ready for life. Because life is going to be way worse than people calling you names, unfortunately. And so, when I hear this stuff, oh, my feelings are hurt. Come on now, toughen up. It's going to get way worse than that.
In the Pope's response, he spoke against discrimination, but did not directly address the student's request. It comes after the Pope has faced backlash for reports that he used offensive language against gay men in a closed-door meeting. Reportedly, the Pope said gay men should not be allowed to train for the priesthood and used an offensive slur. The Pope later apologized to those who were hurt. Now, I heard a comedian say that the Pope is allowed to say that word because he's gay-coded, because he wears a fancy dress and fancy hat. Of course, she was...
I didn't know wearing liturgical garments is gay-coded. That sounds interesting. Okay.
Being cheeky, saying if I was PR for the Pope, this is how I would handle it. But I think an apology is a better handling of it than that.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, we could certainly suggest that the Pope gets some better PR, but I'm glad that guy's not the Pope's PR.
I guess the problem was he said it once, and then the Vatican apologized on his behalf, and then there was a report that he said it again, which was obviously not great judgment. But it's...
No, that was interesting. That really did surprise me. First of all, it surprised me a little bit that he would use the term, but then I thought, okay, well, maybe he's just not familiar with the particular term, and how it will just unnecessarily point people away from what he's trying to tell them about the reality of this sin. Because again, Pope Francis believes homosexuality is a sin. People need to repent of this. And that's the ultimate message that we want to bring to people. And sometimes using that term is going to unnecessarily push people away from the discussion and from the fact that they need to hear a call of repentance. And so I just thought, well, maybe Pope Francis just wasn't aware. I mean, he's a Spanish speaker and the term was Italian. So, okay, maybe that's what it was. But then he comes out and says it again. So it's like, okay, I suspect that he knows at this point that it's an offensive term, unless somebody just came and told him, hey, you said something offensive. And he said, okay, I'm sorry for that. And then the apology was issued and he was never told what the term was that was offensive. Like, I don't think that that's what happened, probably. I mean, it seems really unlikely. So I just kind of feel like, I guess he was doubling down on this intentionally. It's really hard to believe otherwise. I don't know. It's just not what I would expect from Pope Francis. But all right, it happened again. Okay.
It's interesting, to see the quick shift, I think, from a couple of years ago when Pope Francis had made this public statement, it was a little bit, I think, vague, but gave the impression that the Catholic Church was changing its stance on how it viewed gay sexual relationships. And then he also took flack from some conservative Catholics even more recently for saying that it was okay to bless same-sex unions.
All right, so, yeah, a lot of people have misunderstood Pope Francis, and so they're experiencing cognitive dissonance when Pope Francis says something like, gay marriage isn't marriage, homosexuality is sinful, gay unions can't be blessed. She here said that he had said that gay unions can be blessed with fiducia. She's actually going to correct herself here in a moment. Yeah, that was what we heard, and they were wrong all along. As I've said, literally from day one that document came out, Fiducia Supplicans. It was not the union or the relationship that can be blessed. It's rather persons who are in this disordered union, and not to validate anything that they're doing, but rather as a call to repent, as a call to turn away from sin and to receive grace from God to turn further away from sin and better prepare themselves for the sacrament of confession. So that's what the purpose of Fiducia was all along. And she's actually going to pick up here on that here in just a second and correct what she just said.
Another sort of confusing statement, which when you actually read it, was talking about how you can bless individual people who are in same-sex unions. You can't bless the union itself.
Good for her. How does this, I don't know her as a Catholic commentator. So how does she get it? It's not like she's, a Catholic commentator every single day in the mix, with all of these particular points about the papacy or something. She's not a Vaticanista or anything like that. So how does she get it? How does she understand what fiducia is? And then all of the experts don't. That's a rebuke for all of the experts out there. Even she gets it. And she's not even an expert in the area. So good for her.
It's kind of complicated. But he's long been accused of basically giving too much ground to things that are considered opposed to church teaching.
He's been accused of it. That's true. He has been accused of it, but it's not true.
But then he comes out and drops like an anti-gay slur, and now the LGBTQ community is like, wait, we thought you were on our side. What's going on?
They should have had warning signs when Pope Francis had already said homosexuality is a sin. You didn't need to hear a gay slur to know that he's not in favor of homosexual acts. When, again, for crying out loud, he says sin cannot be blessed, and he's literally talking contextually about homosexuality. And then he explicitly says homosexuality is a sin. And then he explicitly says any sexual act outside of a marriage between one man and one woman open to procreation is inadmissible and immoral and sinful. Like, that maybe didn't raise a flag for you. It's only whenever he uses this slur. which again, I don't understand why people are offended by it. Look, if homosexuals come up with a slur for heterosexuals, I'm not gonna be offended by the slur. I really, I don't care what you say about me, because I've been through way worse than people calling me names. I've been physically beaten for my for just existing. In some cases, for being white. Interestingly enough, and so somebody calling me a name just doesn't phase me, I guess. But again, there's some people out there that I suppose are very fragile, and so if they're called a name, that just like destroys their world. And again, I'm not saying calling people names is right. I'm not saying that bullying is right, but what I'm saying is life is tough, and you're going to have to endure way more than people calling you names. So I just find it a little weird that people are just really preoccupied by the conversation of name calling when there's much um, uh, more severe things that we should be addressing. Anyways, let's move forward.
Going on.
Which side are you on, Pope Francis? Do you see him as a liberal, as a resident member of the Catholic community,
Yeah.
a liberal servant of Satan?
Liberal, yeah.
not
serv-
Yeah, no, actually, I'm gonna stop you right there. Although she's gonna correct that here in a moment. Um, I wouldn't even say he's liberal. No, despite his comments recently about conservative, he's very conservative. I did a whole video talking about it, pointing out that the way he's using conservative is not the way most Americans are using conservative, and that's going to cause some confusion. And that confusion originates with Pope Francis. That's where Pope Francis could do better, because oddly enough, he's conservative. He's very much against abortion, against transgender surgeries. He's against homosexual acts. And so he's very what we would call conservative in the United States, but the way he's defining it is a little different. That does, in part, among other issues, give rise to this narrative that he's a liberal, and he's not. Um, so yeah, there's a little bit of confusion going on here. She says, well, okay, he's a liberal, but not a servant of Satan. He's neither. Ironically, the man who accused him of being a servant of Satan, Archbishop Vigano, soon to be excommunicated, himself does appear to be a servant of Satan, because he's calling people away from communion with the successor of St. Peter, the Catholic Church established by Jesus Christ. Not only that, but he also failed to act on certain credible allegations against Cardinal McCarrick and sexual allegations made against him. He failed to investigate those in 2012, which is going to blow a hole in the narrative we're about to hear about Vigano.
Servant of Satan, no.
Okay.
No, I don't have any evidence of that. And I think there's going to be a lot of people who are misunderstanding, I think, what's actually going on here with the Archbishop. The truth is that the Archbishop is very revered in the United States because of his help with exposing some of the child sex scandals in the church.
Yeah, so okay, there might be a group in the United States that reveres him, but there's also plenty of Catholics in the United States that don't revere him and believe he's a madman. And she says that he's revered because he brought to light sex abuse issues. Actually, it's the exact opposite. That narrative turns out to be false. It turns out that it was, again, Vigano who did not put a leash on the accused Cardinal McCarrick when he could have and had multiple opportunities, knowing what McCarrick was accused of. Did not put a leash on him. In fact, he's publicly validating the guy and praising him in videos in 2012. And again, in 2012, he's specifically instructed by Cardinal Wallet in the Vatican to follow up with a priest who said that McCarrick had sexually abused him. And he's specifically told to follow up with this, investigate it, confront McCarrick about it, and then report back to the Vatican. Never did it. Never followed up with that credible accusation. And as a result, the Vatican did not become aware of some other things surrounding McCarrick until like 2017, 2018. That's why it took so long for them to address McCarrick and laicize him. That would have happened earlier if Vigano had done his job as papal nuncio back in 2012. He spent his entire time as nuncio up until 2016 not doing a thing about McCarrick. Those facts came out in 2012, but for some reason, they didn't gain any traction in the media. Very few people addressed it in 2012. I think Austin Ivory was one of the few who addressed that specific point. But that's information has been out since 2012, and it blows a hole in the narrative that somehow Vigano is the guy sounding the alarm on sex abuse. No, he's the guy who's in part responsible for not following up with credible claims in relation to Cardinal McCarrick. And then it appears that what he did is when he realized, hey, this report is about to come out and show that I had a hand in some of this by failing to follow up with these credible claims, he tries to deflect and put it on to Pope Francis and says, Pope Francis knew about this in 2013, and I warned him about, McCarrick, even though, again, the receipts and all of the facts actually show otherwise. And so he tried to spin it and put it on Pope Francis. Turns out all that is false. Now, I go into that in 3.5 hours of details, of facts, dates, times, places, everything, receipts that Vigano has never refuted or engaged to this day in 4 years. I go over that in a video just showing all of this. So if you want to see it, you need to check this video out. I'm pulling it up right now. It's called the, let's see here. You find it, McCarrick. Okay, here we go. Pulling it up. Take a look at my channel. Go to the live section. 3.5 hours. I'm getting the title for it right now. And it doesn't want to come up now. Please don't tell me YouTube took it down. That would be insane. Okay, well, I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes. In fact, I think I already did. Go ahead and check it right now. Let's see. Yes. Nope, I didn't. I really hope YouTube did not take it down. Okay, they didn't. It's Uncovering the Real Story, Archbishop Vigano and Cardinal McCarrick. Let me share my screen so you can see that right here. For some reason, it wasn't coming up when it normally does. Uncovering the Real Story, Archbishop Vigano and Cardinal McCarrick. I'm going to put that in the show notes. You can go and watch it. All of the information you'll ever need. I wanted to see, hey, did Vigano explain somehow that this is all a big misunderstanding and all this information showing that he failed to follow up with credible accusations against McCarrick when he was nuncio? Does he have like an excuse for this? Is this a big misunderstanding? Does he have evidence to the contrary? I want to hear both sides. I always want to consider both sides. No, instead what he did is he just said, oh, this is a hit piece against me, and, issued veiled threats and stuff like that, but never addressed the facts against him, nor did any of the Vigano splainers out there when 2020 came around, and this document came out November, I believe it was November 10th. Let me find the document specifically. Yeah, November of 2020. And again, I explore all of that right here in that video. So go and check that out for more. So that blows a hole in this narrative. That somehow Vigano is this great defender and is this whistleblower. No, it actually turns out that he had a hand in failing to address this problem that he knew about as early as 2006. And still failed to rein in McCarrick when he had multiple opportunities. In fact, McCarrick came to Vigano and said, hey, Vigano, do you want me to go into a deeper retirement and stop appearing in public and stuff like that? Vigano doesn't say anything. Nothing. The dude set it up on a tee for you, Vigano. What are you doing? you had it made. I mean, put it on a platter. All you had to do is just say, yeah, maybe you want to get out of the public sphere. Nope, nope. Instead, he's going around with them to events and praising the guy publicly. We got it in video. Wild stuff. But again, it blows a hole in this narrative. So I think the Hill needs to investigate that information from this Vatican document that came out detailing everything.
Church, which is obviously a great service. But his language in promoting disunity in the church and going after the Pope quite explicitly. He's also been accused of bringing people into the priesthood that are not properly trained. I mean, those are just obviously not acceptable under Catholic canon. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see him.
No, not just bringing people that aren't properly trained, illicitly ordaining them. Vigano's illicitly ordaining priests. That's not the same as bringing somebody in who's not properly trained.
Ultimately defrocked. And I think there's good reason for it.
Yeah, using a derogatory word like that, it definitely rocked people everywhere. So many people were talking about it. I know I had a Catholic grandmother, how important the Pope is to a lot of, Roman Catholics especially. And so she came here from Italy and her husband died when my dad was a teenager. So I never met my grandfather, but I thought the Pope was my grandmother's boyfriend because his picture was always on the refrigerator. And we're like, who is this, Grandma? Like, why is he all over the fridge? And she's like, oh, it's my boyfriend. And we would see the Pope on TV and be like, oh, Grandma's boyfriend's on TV again. And I didn't realize that my grandmother didn't know
Grandma's into celibate men. Okay.
The Pope until later in life. But a very important figure. So many people follow what the Pope says. I think it's very interesting to have this kind of hierarchy of who you're paying attention to and who's giving, religious doctrine essentially for this community of Catholics around the world. And so our politics has become divided where people in different ideologies disagree on morals so heavily. And of course, there's going to be people that feel like they fall on different sides of a political spectrum, and that goes on to affect their religious beliefs because the political spectrum involves statements that are pretty concrete and pretty on opposite sides around morality. And so we're at a point where the Pope's getting political.
Yeah, I consider myself pretty traditional, but there are elements of the so-called trad cath movement that I think are very troubling. And one of those is that they tend to really, worship's not quite the right word, but obsess over this idea of pushing back against the Pope, which I think is not great for the church as a whole.
It's not just pushing back against the Pope, though. It's actually falsely accusing him in many instances, and then going against his magisterium. This is where I think she could do a little bit better as far as researching what the magisterium is, one's obligation to assent to it. We're going to hear some comments here that I think could use a little bit of work, but on the whole, she's in the right direction. So I'm actually surprised by her commentary. She's in the right direction. She just needs a little bit more information, and she'll be a useful resource. Not that she isn't already from what we've seen, but what I'm saying is she'll be more of a useful resource in blowing a hole in some of these narratives. So let's continue.
And in terms of the political question too, I think they often tend to take Pope Francis criticizing conservatives to mean criticizing like political conservatives in the United States. And his conception of what conservative means is, I think, a little bit different than.
She's on to something here. That's exactly what I said when Pope Francis came out with those comments. I said, the way he's using the term conservative is different from how most of us are going to hear it, because Pope Francis is conservative according to most of our definitions of that term. And so he's actually going to be adding to the confusion here in this discussion, which is unfortunate, and why I think he needs to do a little bit better there. She's on point here. So again, I'm a little surprised she's picking up on this.
How we understand it. So there's just a lot of complicated moving parts here, and people tend to try to look at it through this US political lens that's not always super helpful. And then there's also this common misconception where people think that if like the Pope says something, no matter what it is, that it's doctrine and you have to agree with it or you have to follow it. And the truth is,
that's partly true, but she's about to misunderstand it and say something that's not true about the magisterium. I mean, obviously, if the Pope is just saying something off the cuff, he's not teaching. Yes, that's not authoritative and binding on one's conscience. So if he's just like giving an interview or something on a plane, no, that's not authoritative. And so, insofar as that's what she means, I agree. But watch this.
In order for the Pope to be speaking on doctrinal questions and to change an element of Catholic doctrine or an understanding of Catholic doctrine, there's a long process that goes into that involved.
Actually, no. Actually, no. Not at all. He just simply needs to teach in one way or another, whether it's through preaching, whether it's through a document. Now, I certainly believe that there should be a long process of proper research before he teaches, but very technically, no, there doesn't have to be a very long process. He just needs to speak up and teach as the Pope.
Involving Vatican scholars and researchers and Catholic historians and theologians, and he would have to be exercising his authority to speak infallibly, which is only...
No, that's incorrect. He does not have to exercise the charism of infallibility to teach authoritatively a doctrine. We have an entire category where he can teach non-definitively. And in fact, the vast majority of papal teachings for the last 2,000 years, and a significant part of the College of Bishops and their teaching, would also be in this category of non-definitive teaching. So no, he doesn't have to operate within that charism of infallibility to teach authoritatively. I mean, so you want to start with Lumen Gentium 25 that has an entire section that talks about this. You want to look at the Profession of Faith that has that third paragraph after the Nicene Creed. It has a third paragraph that talks about this category. You want to read more about it by checking out Ratzinger's commentary on it with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, commentary on the concluding paragraphs of the Profession of Faith. So no, this is factually mistaken, and this is where so many people get it wrong. They think unless the Pope is teaching infallibly, I don't have to listen, and it's not doctrinal, it's not authoritative. False. That's never been true. We've never limited papal authority or even conciliar authority or episcopal authority to infallible statements. That's truncating magisterial authority, and we're missing a huge chunk of magisterial teachings when we do that. So this is 100% false. This is where I think she needs to do a little bit more research.
Involving Vatican scholars and researchers and Catholic historians and theologians, and he would have to be exercising his authority to speak infallibly, which has only happened, I think, 3 or 4 times in modern history since the idea of papal infallibility actually.
No. So she's trying to say, since the idea of papal infallibility, I think what she's trying to say is since the definition of it in Pastor Eternus in the 1870, I think that's what she's trying to say. I mean, obviously the idea of papal infallibility originates in Scripture, so it's 2,000 years old. I think what she's trying to say is, again, since it's definition at a council, she's saying it's only been exercised a few times since then. I think actually one could push back and say it's been exercised a little bit more than what people think. But yeah, this is where I think, again, we need a little bit more catechesis. But she's in the right direction. We just need to go a step further and do a little bit more research here.
Became a part of Catholic doctrine. So if the Pope goes out and says something...
Again, papal infallibility has been part of Catholic doctrine for 2,000 years. Read the Sixth Ecumenical Council. I have a whole show going into it extensively, especially in relation to the question of the condemnation of Honorius. And read Agatho's letter to the emperor at the Sixth Ecumenical Council, and it's clear that papal indefectibility in its teaching office was expressed at that council. So no, this is not something new. This is not something arising recently. This is something that's been there all along.
That like a trad cath or a liberal Catholic disagrees with, it's not Catholic doctrine. He's just speaking, you know, I mean, obviously as the Pope, we should respect him. That's sort of the view I take, is that I always respect what the Pope has to say and I try to understand it, but you don't have to agree with everything that the Pope says unless he's actually speaking from his authority as the Pope on a matter of Catholic doctrine.
behind
the
closed doors
distinction.
doesn't count. But do you think this is going to spark a larger conversation around whether or not a priest can be a gay man? And of course, we've had cases, come out where it's been exposed that priests have been gay men. Of course, it's already happened. But do you think it's going to open a larger conversation around how Catholics feel about having their priest be a gay man?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's already happened in a sense in response to the sexual abuse scandal, because there was a backlash against allowing gay men to be priests because there was the perception that they would be more likely to abuse young boys in the church. But I think the general principle is still and always has been that you can have same-sex attraction and not act on it. And
This is incorrect. This is also, she's missing some information here. Pope Francis, in his magisterium, this isn't just rumors behind closed doors, in his magisterium has officially backed up, again, magisterial documents that say that men with deep-seated homosexual inclinations, so deep-seated homosexual attraction, whether they act on it or not, if it's a deep-seated homosexual attraction, they cannot be ordained to the priesthood. Now, if it's not deep-seated, if it's something fleeting, and they have addressed it 3 years prior to ordination to the diaconate, they could be admitted into seminary. But she's missing this. So again, it's magisterial. This is something he officially and publicly has backed up multiple times now. So it's not just something behind closed doors. And she is absolutely inaccurate when she says that, well, you can have this tendency and be ordained, basically, as long as you're just not acting on it or, molesting somebody. No, that's not the limitation to this discussion. The exclusion of men with a deep-seated homosexual tendency, they're inadmissible to seminary. Why? Well, the document expressly explains it. In fact, there's a 2006 Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith document that goes into detail why. And because it causes difficulty in human interaction and relations with other people, among other reasons. And so the magisterium has repeatedly said no to this, and Pope Francis has backed that up about 4 times publicly now.
Still be a priest, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Right. I think your perspective on it's very interesting. We've talked about it on the show before, but this idea that, while it is a sin to be a member of the LGBTQ plus community, it's not that we as Catholics must shun them from society. It's that we're all sinners. And
and it's also not even just.
Yeah, we need to nuance that more. When she says it's a sin. Okay, so if somebody has attraction to people of the same sex, that is a result of original sin. So it is disordered. It is a disordered desire. As far as just having the attraction, again, though it's a result of original sin, the element of personal culpability in sin hasn't yet been introduced. Just having that disordered disposition is not in and of itself. One is not culpably in sin for just having the disposition, though it does originate from original sin. The element of sin is introduced and culpability is introduced when we act on it, whether in thought or deed. That's when an element of sin is involved. And so if a person who has that disposition acts on it, that's when that person is in sin. But if they're not acting on it, again, the inclination is a result of original sin, but the personal level of culpability is not there. So when she talks about people who are in the community, like, what do you mean? Like, out there celebrating this stuff? Well, yeah, that's sinful, obviously. But just simply having that disposition or that attraction is not in and of itself going to introduce culpability. So there's a more nuanced level that needs to be had here in this discussion.
Just being a member of the community, but actively engaging in sexual activities that are with a member of the same sex, just as if you were to have sex outside of marriage in a straight relationship, that would be considered a sin as well.
Yeah.
Yes, it would, but there is greater gravity for homosexual acts. And this is one of the problems I have in these discussions is, yes, all sexual acts are wrong, but some sexual acts are worse than others. Some are more grave than others. So masturbation would be a grave sin, but it is not as bad as and not as gravely disordered and immoral as homosexual acts. So it doesn't need to be put in the same category. Yes, it's all grave matter, but some are more grave than others. And that's a point that we're losing in these discussions. And that is not a point that needs to be lost in these discussions. We need to realize there are degrees to sin, and there are some things that are graver than others.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, because it is taboo, like my parents are not people who are anti-LGBTQ+, but they didn't grow up around it. And so there's, feelings of not understanding it, I think, and not fully understanding, the transgender community. And it's not hateful, but it's this skepticism. But I do think there are a lot of people that, find it to be just gross and weird and different. And
that's not the point. That's not the issue. If that's the realm that people are in, is that they just think it's gross, you're missing it. It's not about that. It's about God is saying, don't do this because, number one, it's offensive to him. And then number two, it is offensive to you. It is wrong for you to act in this kind of way. That's where the discussion needs to be. Is it an offense to God? And is it a sin against oneself and one's neighbor? That's where the conversation needs to be, not, do you think it's icky? Like, that's not what it is.
And treat it differently than they would treat other sins like sex before marriage.
Yeah, I think that's
okay. But in reality, in fairness, it is different than just heterosexual sex before marriage. Both are grave. Both will send you to hell, but one is worse than the other according to sacred scripture, divine revelation. It's not a point that we need to overlook here.
That's fair. And we should definitely be mindful of making sure that we're not condemning certain sexual sins more than others.
No, she's wrong there. This is not what divine revelation teaches. Divine revelation does condemn certain sins more than others. This is where we need better catechesis as Catholics.
But I guess at the same time, you don't want to say that you treat every sin the same, because like obviously murder would be worse than like taking God's name in vain. So that's levels.
Very fair. All right, we're going to continue to follow.
Okay, so not a bad discussion, a little surprising as far as some of the points that were made there that were accurate, and they don't tend to be accurate whenever these discussions are had at a popular level like this. But there were some points of deficiency there that need to we need to improve in, and so I wanted to offer a contribution here. Hopefully it was helpful. If it is, hit that like button. Hit the subscribe button so we can reach more people with this information. And let's celebrate this good news that we saw in the first segment of this show with Pope Francis and the Institute of Christ the King. Let's rejoice in that. And I suspect we'll continue to see some more victories in this area, but I will keep you apprised as the information comes out. So stay tuned for more. Again, hit that subscribe button. We'll see you later. God bless. Hey friends, do you want others to discover why the Catholic Church is the church that Jesus established? And do you want to help people make sense of all the confusion in the Catholic Church today? Help contribute to this mission by supporting Reason and Theology at patreon.com/Reason and Theology. By doing so, you'll also get access to exclusive content for patrons only. Also, if you want to deepen your faith, there are free ebooks and even courses that you can sign up for by visiting reason.podia.com. Have you ever heard someone say that Pope Francis denied the existence of hell, or Pope Francis worshipped an idol in the Vatican gardens? There are many claims that have been made about Pope Francis for over a decade, and many of them are inaccurate. I've set the record straight in my free ebook called Top 10 Lies About Pope Francis Exposed. Get your free copy today by visiting reason.podia.com.